and a warm welcome to the Open Treasury podcast, your go-to source for the latest news and analysis in corporate cash and treasury management. This show is brought to you by CTMfile.com and the Treasury News Network, where treasury professionals learn and share the information that matters most. I am your host, Pushpendra Mehta. Joining me today is Ben Poole, writer at CTMfile. Ben, wish you a happy new year and the very best for 2024.
Thank you, Push. Happy New Year to you too.
Ben, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to converse with you again. So a very big thank you to you for taking the time to share your perspectives with us on topics that impact the world of treasury management and beyond. In today's edition, we shall discuss 4 topics, namely the concluding part of the 4-part article series titled Top 8 Priority Areas for Corporate Treasury in 2024, CFO sentiment toward current economic conditions in North America, Europe, and China, UK economic outlook for 2024, and finally, the European Central Bank to conduct a cyber resilience stress test on 109 directly supervised banks this year. Our audience can read articles, interviews, and industry roundups by visiting ctmfile.com or by following the links in our show notes. Ben, on CTMfile, as you know, we have published a 4-part article series titled Top 8 Areas of Priority for Corporate Treasury in 2024. Of the 8 areas, we have chosen 2 focus areas for our discussion today, namely emerging technologies to gain traction in the treasury space, and leadership will be the most important skill for treasurers in 2024. Please feel free to differ with our opinion, to give us your honest opinion as you deem fit. Let's start with emerging technologies to gain traction in the treasury space. Amidst the prevailing global economic uncertainty and heightened geopolitical risks, corporate treasuries are expected to expedite their pace of digitization and automation by embracing emerging technologies to improve cash flow visibility and liquidity forecasting to achieve greater efficiency and mitigate risks, including cybersecurity threats. Of all the emerging technologies, artificial intelligence and machine learning made the headlines in 2023, and for good reason, as they are expanding the list of tasks computers can adequately perform, observe Strategic Treasurer's latest Treasury Technology Analyst report. Even though AI was big news last year, treasury professionals didn't extensively adopt it in 2023, with only 14% of respondents surveyed in the analyst report incorporating AI in their treasury operations. According to Strategic Treasurer's Treasury Tech Analyst report, the primary areas where AI and ML impacted the treasury management systems were cash forecasting and anomaly detection. Over the next 12 months, emerging technologies such as application programming interfaces or APIs, AI and machine learning are poised to make a substantial impact on the treasury function. Ben, do you concur with this viewpoint? And if so, in which areas of cash and treasury management are emerging technologies likely to have the most significant impact?
Thanks, Push. First off, I just wanted to congratulate you on this really fascinating article series. Anyone that's listening that's not seen some of the other entries in this series, do head over to ctmfile.com and check them out. There's some really fascinating 8 topics covered. But like you say, emerging technologies, the point that you made in this piece is a really good one, I think, in terms of the impact these technologies will have across some of those areas that you mentioned. Like, I think cash flow forecasting is an obvious one for AI. But one thing I wanted to say is that treasurers really need to have a data strategy in place before engaging with these type of technologies. You know, what is the end goal? What data does treasury need to make that happen? Where is that data within the organization? Because of course, not all of it will organically be on treasury systems. And who manages that data? You know, there's a lot of conversations that need to take place to make sure that treasury can get visibility over all the data that is needed to really make these technologies work, because you need particularly for kind of AI, large language models, you need vast amount of data to kind of train them in the ways that you're working and the way that you want to use them. And you touched on APIs there, which are, I think, kind of go hand in hand with AI, because they're a really great option to bring all of that data into one sort of central repository or data lake or whatever you want to call it. You know, getting it all together in one place is so important, because without that, these technologies, they're not going to work for you. So if you can get all the data like that, then you're really ready to start experimenting with things like AI and machine learning. And one phrase that I've heard is AI can be a co-worker in Treasury. So it's not going to take the job of the treasurer, although it might change the shape perhaps of a Treasury team, but it's more that it's providing data to treasurers, you know, in real time. They've got a decision to make. What are the things that they need to consider? What are the data points? And AI can very quickly provide those, and then also perhaps map out some possible options that the treasurer might have thought of, but might not have thought of. So it's just kind of a more insightful tool, I suppose, to kind of increase efficiency. The future's bright. Like you say, not much is happening or has been adopted, particularly by treasurers in that space as yet. But I think we're going to move from the hype that we had last year into some real practical use cases and case studies that some of the leading firms and corporates will be engaged with. And then you'll see that sort of trickle down effect, as you tend to with new different types of treasury technology when they come online. It can be the really, really big firms and the really sort of tech savvy firms that are the early adopters and get that almost early advantage. But by getting all that work done at the top end, it can start trickling down, and then you might get even more vendors in the space offering practical solutions that treasurers can take advantage of. So I think it's an exciting time, but it's still a bit of a watch this space area as well.
Ben, thank you for adding a refreshing dimension to the viewpoint that emerging technologies is likely to gain traction in the treasury space, particularly with your comments on data. Let's move forward to the second focus area, which is leadership. Leadership will be the most important skill for treasurers in 2024, in my viewpoint. An array of challenges awaits corporate treasuries this year, including a series of high-profile global elections, rise in regulatory scrutiny, geopolitical conflicts, climate vulnerabilities, high borrowing costs, a probable surge in payments fraud, and the potential threat of AI to treasury and finance careers in, some people's minds, not perhaps for everybody. Navigating these complexities necessitates the demonstration of extraordinary leadership skills. This fact is corroborated by the latest Citi Global Perspectives and Solutions Study report titled Treasury Leadership, Does It Matter?, which states that organizations that nurture treasury leadership enjoy better financial performance. Citi estimates the top 40 performing treasuries, as measured by this study, generated $44 billion of additional earnings over the last 5 years, attributable to their better treasury performance. Ben, in light of the cavalcade of challenges that corporate treasury is expected to confront this year, leadership, as I said, in my mind, will stand out as the most important skill for treasurers in 2024. What, according to you, characterizes extraordinary leaders in the treasury landscape, and what can be done by treasurers to cultivate a culture of leadership excellence in treasury departments?
Well, it's interesting on the question of leadership that from the report there, Push, that it's not entirely in the treasurer's own hands. The Citi survey that you quoted highlights the importance of organizations nurturing treasury leadership. So that environment is crucial. You might have someone that's dynamic and has lots of qualities that a leader has, but if they're in an organization that treasury is kind of a back office function pushed away, not really getting much strategic input into what's happening in the organization, that can sort of cut off that opportunity. So that environment is really important. I also think the way that the role of corporate treasury within an organization has evolved over the past 10 or 15 years is important here. The fact that it's much more strategic when allowed to be really gives treasurers a status within the business that perhaps they didn't have before. So if they have that opportunity, it's then what they do with it that really counts. So when I started writing about corporate treasury, about 20 years ago now, it was a place that was very much seen as like a stepping stone in a career journey. But what I think we see a bit more today is that many financial professionals are starting to see it as the dream destination in their career. It's a place to aspire to where you can have a significant impact on the direction and success of the company. So I think all these changes and particularly that strategic line of how that's becoming embedded within Treasury makes it a place that people that are natural leaders within business can aspire to be. So, I think that's a really interesting point. It's not one that I'd really thought of until you pulled it out in your article, Push.
Can I ask you a follow-up question in terms of leadership? You mentioned that when you started out covering Treasury and your journey across the last 20 years, do you think writing about so many or varied facets of Treasury, talking about leadership, do you think it has evolved or the way you have seen it over the last 20 years, given your experience of having seen it in different parts of the world, in different kinds of organizations?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the point that I mentioned earlier around it wasn't the dream destination. Often it would just be somewhere you'd go and park yourself for a year as you were kind of doing the rounds of all the different departments in the finance business within an organization. It was like you needed to tick that off if you were going to aspire to be a CFO, for example. And I think the way that the world has changed since that time, if you just go back to the global financial crisis, which really was quite a trigger to set Treasury on this more strategic path, that kind of changed everything. And we've had a lot of crises since then in the markets that a lot of it has come down to treasurers to protect capital, the cash of the company. That could be character forming, I think. So that's a way that you can get leaders. But obviously you need a lot of training, I would suggest, and education along the way as well to help in a corporate environment be able to almost articulate the ideas that you have and be able to get across what you're trying to do as a treasurer, how you can actually link up with other departments in the business and kind of take a lead of certain topics where, perhaps Treasury hasn't always been there. They might have been a stakeholder, but might just have had a seat at the table rather than leading the discussion. So I think all those things have been in flux and been changing over the past decade or so, and for the better for treasurers. If you're in Treasury, that's a good thing. I think that you're getting that greater exposure across the business.
From the 4-part article series titled Top 8 Areas of Priority for Corporate Treasury in 2024, published on CTMfile.com, let's now shift the conversation to the second topic in today's discussion, which is about CFOs dimming their economic outlook for North America, Europe, and China. CFO sentiment toward current economic conditions in North America, Europe, and China fell at the end of 2023. This is according to the Deloitte CFO Signals report for Q4 2023. In contrast, CFOs upped their views toward current economic conditions in Asia, excluding China, with 28% of CFOs considering current conditions as good, an increase from 24% in the third quarter of 2023. Ben, you covered the story for CTMfile. Can you please throw light on the key findings of the Deloitte CFO Signals report and how these findings are likely to impact corporate treasury?
Off the top to note, the CFO Signals survey polls CFOs across the US, Canada, and Mexico, and the vast majority of those are from firms that have more than $1 billion in annual revenue. So clearly from what you've just inferred from the research there, CFOs have a far more conservative outlook kind of at the start of the year, particularly compared to the previous CFO Signals survey. I mean, there was some positivity around Asia, obviously, but a lot of the big hitters that are in the title there suggest that there's not as much optimism. And there are obviously plenty of reasons for that. There's the continued impact of high interest rates. Inflation is still sticking around in different markets. And obviously tensions caused by geopolitical conflict, which just seem to keep escalating. So That's, I think, some of the key drivers as to why there's a slightly more downbeat approach. But I do think the concerns are also contrasted a little bit by signals that this new year will bring greater mergers and acquisitions activity, M&A activity, and also investments in digital technologies for strategic and operational purposes. And the M&A point, I think it's really interesting that CFOs are looking to M&A as a growth lever this year. Just from the stats, slightly more than 1/3, so 34% expect their companies to increase the average number of deals they close over the next year, compared to just 13 thinking they're going to have a decline. So there's clearly things are in growth mode there. And also looking further out, 51% surveyed project M&A to account for between 1 and 10% of their company's growth in the next 3 years. And 19% think that between 11 and 50% of their company's growth will come from M&A in that period. So, the end of last year was tough. No one's really under any illusions about that. But should the Federal Reserve sort of come through on some of these expectations for reduced interest rates, that could be something that also potentially kicks more deal making into progress in the year ahead. So I think, cautious optimism is probably the phrase to use here.
Cautious optimism. Those are wise words. The next topic in today's discussion is about CTMfile's article on the UK economic outlook for 2024. The UK has had a difficult economic situation since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Although there has been an increase in GDP, there has been a rise in inflation, resulting in a stagnant real GDP with the ongoing possibility of a recession. However, Goldman Sachs reports that the economy has shown surprising growth resilience and so far avoided recession. Goldman Sachs says that we expect growth to improve modestly in 2024 as real disposable income rises and the growth drag from the BOE's tightening diminishes. We look for growth of 0.6% next year, slightly above consensus, says the Goldman Sachs report. Ben, you live in the UK. You've covered Treasury for 2 decades. You understand the entire arena of economics and finance. Do you think 2024 will be a better year for the UK, even as Goldman Sachs' analysis of the main growth drivers points to a modest pickup in growth in 2024?
Wow, that is kind of the £1 million question, I suppose. We also had, some new GDP data released this week that kind of underlines what that Goldman Sachs report was saying. So quarterly GDP for the UK in the 3 months to November last year is estimated to have fallen 0.2% compared to the 3 months to August, the previous quarter, from data from the Office for National Statistics. Services showed no growth in that time. Production output fell 1.5% and construction fell by 0.6%. as well. But there is a crumb of good news amongst all of that, because on the monthly data, and obviously that's a much smaller sample size, but the monthly GDP was estimated to have grown by 0.3% in November, following a fall of 0.3 in October. So November's uptick was mainly driven by the services sector, where output grew by 0.4%. Production output grew by 0.3%, that had fallen 1.3 in October. So that's turned around. And the construction sector fell by 0.2%, but having fell 0.4% in October, that also, maybe the parachute has been deployed there. So overall, this latest batch of GDP data suggests that the UK economy is in perhaps slightly better shape than anticipated. And while that's good news, it does also at the same time put a spotlight on what the market is thinking about interest rates, currently pricing 120 basis points of interest rate cuts from the Bank of England throughout 2024. It's important to remember that core inflation has been particularly sticky in the UK. It's currently 5.1%, which is obviously a considerable level above the Bank of England's 2% target rate. And the problems with inflation here have been augmented by certain issues in the labour market. So Brexit has shrunk the available workforce in the country, and there's a relatively high proportion of workers that are on the long-term sick list following the pandemic. So there's definitely challenges in the labour market. We've also seen the housing market remain quite robust, and as we've seen, economic data is showing a little bit above expectations. So in this climate, it's hard to see the Bank of England starting an aggressive cycle of rate cuts, the economy is so far showing that to this point, it can kind of take the medicine of the higher rates for longer, which I think is the policy that the Bank of England's going to, pursue this year as it tries to tame that sticky inflation figure. So, I think perhaps, rate cuts, everyone's very excited for them, obviously, but it doesn't seem to me to be something that will happen in the first half of the year. It seems much more of a sort of a second half of the year kickoff point for particularly in the UK.
Next up, let's delve into the fourth story, which is about the European Central Bank, or ECB, to conduct a cyber resilience stress test on 109 directly supervised banks this year. This exercise will assess how banks respond to and recover from a cyber attack rather than their ability to prevent it. Under the stress test scenario, the cyber attack succeeds in disrupting the bank's daily business operations. Bank will then test their response and recovery measures, including activating emergency procedures and contingency plans and restoring normal operations. Supervisors will subsequently assess how banks can cope under such a scenario. Ben, I found this story extremely interesting and thought-provoking. ECB is to test banks' bounce-back ability from cyber attacks. If you were a European corporate treasurer or as a treasury leader had considerable exposure to the European Union, would you consider this development reassuring given that cyber attacks on the financial system are expected to surge in 2024?
I think you certainly want to know, how capable your banks are in those stressful situations, right? We all know how important it is to have a robust cybersecurity program for corporates and particularly for banks that are holding corporate cash. And stress testing the ability to withstand a cyber attack, that's a very valuable exercise to go through. But I think it's really interesting that the ECB here is saying they want to test the recovery reactions of banks. How do they respond when they have fallen victim of a cyber attack? How quickly can they get back and operational? So I think that's something that corporate treasurers will be watching eagerly for the results. And like you say, the risks from cyber attacks are probably higher today than ever. Some of the reasons behind that, we talk about technologies a lot and AI and quantum computing being rolled out across all these banking operations. And obviously these offer significant advantages, but they also introduce new risks and also impose quite high costs on firms as they're building out their cyber defenses. And these higher costs obviously are happening at a time when economic headwinds are already sort of straining cybersecurity resources and budgets. And there's also some cyber disclosure rules that are becoming more prevalent as well. So developments such as generative AI, Gen AI as well, are also kind of competing for IT funds in there as well. So it's not just, oh yeah, we should do this, we'll do it. There's a lot to consider in terms of how you deploy resources to have a program, not only just to keep the gates up around the bank, but then also be able to recover quickly. I think one other thing to keep an eye on perhaps is cyber espionage and IP, intellectual property theft, because again, Gen AI and other emerging technologies are kind of intensifying the technological rivalry between countries and companies and finance firms, fueling this kind of cyber espionage. There was a report from Moody's, which we covered on CTMfile this week, which noted that cyber espionage will also loom large over the national elections worldwide. And of course, as you noted, Push, more than half of the world population is due to vote in major elections this year. So it's a big year for cyber. But for the ECB stress test of banks' cyber bounce back ability, the findings are due to be published this summer. So that's something we'll be keeping a keen eye on to see what the main learnings are, see what the ECB finds, how good are European banks at recovering. And obviously that's something we'll cover on CTMfile when the findings come out. But yeah, I think everyone's looking forward to seeing what they find out.
Absolutely. And I will be eagerly watching this space just as you would. But you're absolutely right when you mention cyber espionage. That will be, given the fact that we have, a series of high-profile global elections across the world, particularly in the major economies this year. You're right, cyber espionage and cyber attacks will be a topic of conversation, and I'm glad you brought it up. Finally, Ben, what is your choice for the biggest or the most important story of the past week and why?
Well, I was thinking about this. We've spoken about the UK's economic situation, so I thought it would be only right to mention Europe at the end here. And today, as we record this on the 16th of January, the ECB has released its latest consumer expectations survey for Eurozone inflation. That's a monthly online survey that kind of takes the temperature of around 14,000 consumers over 6 Eurozone countries, how they feel about inflation in the economic bloc, where they see it's going. And this latest edition found that median consumer inflation expectations for the next 12 months and for 3 years ahead have both declined noticeably. Now, this data point has very much excited the markets. The Financial Times was reporting today that this news has strengthened investor bets that the ECB will start cutting interest rates in April. The euro fell 0.6% against the dollar, and Germany's 10-year bond yield dipped slightly today following the publication of the survey. But there has been a pushback from a number of members of the ECB Governing Council to suggest that the markets are getting a bit ahead of themselves. So, for example, the French central bank governor came out and said it's too early to declare victory over inflation. And a Finnish central bank board member told Reuters, it's better to wait a bit longer than doing a premature exit from this restrictive level and then perhaps having to do a reversal. So I think they want to be so certain that, they're only going to start cutting rates when they're sure that inflation is back at that 2% level. So that's the situation in Europe today regarding the interest rate question. I mean, my feeling is that as things stand, if you look at kind of the US, Europe and the UK, the Fed is probably in the driver's seat at the moment in terms of perhaps being the first to enter a cutting cycle. The ECB is quite close to the Fed, I think. And then the UK, maybe one or two monetary policy meetings later, considering everything that we've mentioned in that earlier story. But obviously, when and where that first cut might come is the issue that everyone is on tenterhooks over.
I couldn't agree more. And you and I will be watching this space very closely, particularly with the Fed, the ECB, and the Bank of England. Well, we've come to the end of this podcast episode, Ben. Thank you for sharing your thought-provoking viewpoints. They've contributed significantly to the richness of today's episode. We would also like to express our deep gratitude to our CTMfile audience for joining us on this edition of the Open Treasury podcast. Please subscribe and look in the show notes for the article links. Thank you and have a great week. This podcast is provided for information purposes only, and statements made by CTMfile or guests on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, or consulting advice. For more information, visit ctmfile.com.